March 10, 1943. Berlin, Reich Air Ministry Headquarters. The room was thick with smoke from half-burned cigars. Outside, snow clung to the edges of Unter den Linden, muffling the sounds of a city still battered from nightly Allied raids. Inside, however, the air crackled with tension. Senior Luftwaffe officers, intelligence analysts, and Abwehr agents filed into a long mahogany chamber, carrying leather folders stuffed with intercepted reports, photographs, and coded transmissions. At the head of the table, Hermann Göring leaned back in his chair, his swollen frame wrapped in a pale blue tunic, eyes gleaming with both arrogance and exhaustion. An agent laid a file on the polished wood, its pages stamped with urgent markings. Confidential, high priority. Inside were reports gathered from neutral observers, Spanish engineers, Swedish trade attaches, even whispers from Mexican officials. Each source, independent of the other, claimed the same unbelievable truth, that in the American Midwest, Henry Ford's automobile empire had been transformed into a factory capable of producing a fully operational B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. The words hung in the chamber like smoke. Göring laughed, a short, dismissive bark. Impossible, he declared. A bomber is not a motor car. It cannot be bolted together like a toy. But the agents pressed on. They read aloud the staggering figures. A plant nearly a mile long, employing over 40,000 workers, running day and night without pause. A workforce that included women, immigrants, and African Americans, people the Reich dismissed as unfit, now welding, riveting, and assembling the most complex war machine ever built. Each bomber, they said, contained over 1.5 million individual parts, 313,000 rivets, and 9,000 separate subassemblies. And yet, the Willow Run plant in Michigan was producing them faster than Germany could finish repairing a single Heinkel. Some of the officers shifted uneasily. They had already seen reports of American tanks rolling off assembly lines in hundreds, of Liberty ships sliding into the Atlantic in mere days. But bombers? Mass-produced like trucks? It was unthinkable. At the far end of the table, Admiral Canaris of the Abwehr remained silent, his expression unreadable. He had reviewed the photographs smuggled out of Detroit, grainy images of endless conveyor belts, wings hanging from cranes, fuselages sliding down steel tracks. To his trained eye, there was no denying the evidence. This was no bluff. America had turned industrial capitalism itself into a weapon of war. Still, Göring scoffed. Let the Americans boast. A plane built by peasants and women cannot fly. Quality will defeat quantity. His voice rose, filled with false confidence, but beneath it was a flicker of unease. He remembered, all too well, the raids over the Ruhr, the relentless waves of flying fortresses that no amount of flak seemed able to stop. And now, if the intelligence reports were true, America would unleash something even more devastating. An unending stream of liberators, each capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs, each rolling off the line as if born from an unstoppable machine. In Detroit, the reality was even more astonishing than the Germans imagined. The Willow Run plant stretched across 3.5 million square feet of Michigan farmland, its assembly line so vast that Ford engineers had to carve a literal bend into it to fit the building's dimensions. Trains arrived daily, hauling aluminum, engines, and rubber. Workers in overalls moved with military precision, attaching wings, riveting fuselages, installing engines, all to the thunder of presses and the hiss of welding torches. Every hour, the line spat out the beating heart of a bomber squadron. Back in Berlin, the German intelligence officer closed his folder. "My Führer," he said quietly, "if these reports are accurate, then America has achieved something we did not believe possible. They are building the sky itself." The silence that followed was suffocating. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, every man in that chamber felt the cold weight of realization. If the Americans truly possessed such power, then the war Germany had believed it could win by sheer willpower was already slipping away. And yet, true to form, the Nazi leadership chose denial. They could not comprehend a world where common workers, organized by industrial genius, could outpace the pride of the Reich's engineers. But deep down, among the spies and analysts who had seen the photos and read the numbers, the truth was undeniable. America had turned the art of mass production into a weapon Germany could never match. The arsenal of democracy had begun to roar, and no amount of disbelief could silence it. While Berlin dismissed the intelligence as exaggeration, across the Atlantic in Michigan, reality was moving faster than imagination itself. Snow lay thick on the farmland outside Ypsilanti, where tractors once cut neat rows of corn and wheat. But in 1941, Henry Ford had chosen this quiet countryside for something utterly unprecedented, a factory not to build cars, but to mass-produce war machines. Willow Run. The name itself would soon become legend. At first, even Ford's own engineers doubted the plan. The B-24 Liberator wasn't a simple automobile. It was the most complex aircraft in the world. It took Consolidated Aircraft in California nearly 2 months to handcraft a single bomber. Ford's proposal to turn that process into a moving assembly line, spitting out 1 bomber an hour, was seen by many as lunacy. And yet, construction began. As steel beams rose and concrete poured, the site became a city unto itself. Covering more than 3.5 million square feet, Willow Run was the largest factory under a single roof anywhere in the world. The building was so vast that architects had to design a quarter-mile L bend into the assembly line, because a straight line would have stretched beyond Michigan state borders. Inside, it was not just the size that astonished visitors, but the rhythm. The thunder of hydraulic presses echoed through the cavernous hall, stamping sheets of aluminum into the skeletons of wings. Sparks showered from welding torches as workers sealed seams that would one day ride the frozen winds at 25,000 feet. Rivet guns chattered like machine fire, stitching skin over bone. Conveyor belts groaned under the weight of engines, landing gear, and bomb racks. And the workers, this was what shocked German spies the most. They were not elite craftsmen trained in military workshops. They were farmers' sons, store clerks, school teachers, and thousands of women who had never set foot in a factory before the war. Rosie the Riveter wasn't a propaganda poster here. She was real, standing on scaffolds, gripping drills, her hair tied back in bandanas. Immigrants from Italy, Poland, and Hungary stood shoulder to shoulder with African-American welders who had left the segregated South for steady work in Detroit. Teenagers too young for the draft carried parts along the line, while men too old to fight machined pistons with hands calloused from a lifetime of labor. Together, they became an army of builders. At first, chaos reigned. Mistakes were constant. Fuselages emerged crooked, engines jammed, rivets popped loose under pressure. A bomber is not a car, critics said again and again. And yet, Henry Ford's engineers refused to surrender. They broke down the Liberator into 313,000 discrete tasks, designing jigs and templates so that even a novice worker could install a component with precision. They simplified, standardized, and repeated until what once seemed impossible became routine. By early 1943, the line was flowing. Subassemblies arrived by train, wings from one station, tail sections from another, engines from yet another. Workers guided them onto the track where, like pieces of an enormous puzzle, they clicked into place. Hour by hour, the skeleton of a bomber grew flesh. Aluminum skin gleamed beneath overhead lights. Propellers spun as engines were tested. Radios crackled to life. And then, at the far end of the line, came the moment of birth. A bomber, christened in sweat and steel, rolled out of Willow Run's massive hangar doors. Every 63 minutes, another followed. By the time Berlin scoffed at the Spies' reports, the plant had already proven itself a miracle of industry. News filtered back to Germany through whispers and photographs. Spies described miles of conveyor belts and cranes swinging wings like toys. They reported production statistics so unbelievable that even seasoned analysts hesitated to repeat them. But for those who saw the photographs, the endless line of bombers stretching toward the horizon, there was no doubt. Back inside Berlin's intelligence chambers, the reports sparked nervous debates. Could quality really survive such speed? Could machines assembled by women and factory novices endure combat? Goring and his circle clung to their prejudices, insisting that mass production meant fragility. But the frontline Luftwaffe pilots, facing squadron after squadron of B-24s over the Ruhr, knew better. These planes flew. They fought. And they killed. Meanwhile, in Michigan, Willow Run became more than a factory. It was a symbol. Workers pinned photographs of brothers, sons, and husbands fighting overseas to the fuselages they were building. Every rivet driven carried a silent prayer. May this bomber end the war sooner. May it bring my loved one home alive. The factory floor echoed not only with machines, but with determination. For the United States, Willow Run was proof that democracy could outproduce dictatorship. Germany had believed its superiority in engineering would guarantee victory. But Ford had weaponized something else entirely, the principle of scale. Where Germany crafted, America manufactured. Where Germany relied on artisans, America relied on armies of workers. As winter deepened in 1943, the pace only accelerated. Ford's workers shattered records, at one point producing 25 bombers in a single day. To the Luftwaffe, struggling to replace lost aircraft after each raid, it was a nightmare. Every German bomber lost over Britain took weeks to replace. Every B-24 lost over Europe was replaced within hours. In the grand halls of Berlin, denial still reigned. Göring continued to boast that German quality would triumph over American quantity. But outside, in the smoking ruins of Hamburg, Cologne, and Essen, civilians knew the truth. The bombers came not in dozens, but in hundreds, filling the skies until daylight seemed to vanish beneath their shadows. By the spring of 1943, even the most skeptical German officers admitted what their spies had warned. Ford's miracle at Willow Run was real. And with every 63 minutes that ticked off the clock, another Liberator was born, another nail hammered into the coffin of the Reich's dreams of victory. The spring of 1943 brought a shift in the air war, though most in Germany did not yet understand why. In factories scattered across the Reich, workers labored to repair shattered Heinkels and Messerschmitts. Pilots grumbled about shortages of fuel and spare parts. But in the skies above Europe, a new sound had begun to roar. It was deeper, heavier, almost endless, the sound of squadrons of B-24 Liberators, their Pratt and Whitney engines beating like war drums. At first, German civilians mistook them for flying fortresses, the B-17s they already knew so well. But Luftwaffe officers quickly realized these were something new, faster, longer-ranged, and arriving in numbers that defied belief. From Hamburg to the Ruhr, from Bremen to Berlin, reports flooded in. Villages swore they saw bombers filling the entire horizon. One survivor later described it as the sky itself breaking open. 4 German fighter pilots. The shock was immediate. A squadron scrambled to intercept near the Dutch coast in May of 1943. The pilots dove through cloud cover, expecting the familiar tight formations of a dozen or so bombers. Instead, they emerged into a wall of aircraft. Dozens stretched before them, row upon row, their contrails weaving together into a solid white canopy. What stunned the Luftwaffe most was not just the sheer number, but the resilience. These machines, built in a factory where women riveted wings and farmers hammered bulkheads, flew with mechanical precision. Hits from 20mm cannon tore holes in their fuselages, yet they kept flying. Engines caught fire, but bombers stayed in formation until their crews bailed out. German intelligence officers who had dismissed the Willow Run reports suddenly recalled the figures. A bomber every 63 minutes. Watching formation after formation pour across the channel, they realized with horror that the math was true. Every loss Germany inflicted would be replaced in less than a day. On the ground, the devastation spoke for itself. In June 1943, the B-24 struck Kiel's submarine pens, ripping through reinforced concrete with bunker-busting bombs. Weeks later, entire districts of Hamburg burned in a firestorm that killed tens of thousands. Civilians huddled in shelters, clutching their children, whispering prayers, as the earth shook from the endless thunder overhead. But in Detroit, the miracle kept accelerating. Willow Run ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Trains rolled in with parts, and finished bombers rolled out onto runways carved into Michigan farmland. Each carried with it the fingerprints of ordinary workers who understood that their labor might turn the tide of war. Some women scrawled notes inside the fuselages. "Good luck, boys," or "Send this one back safe." Airmen would later discover these messages mid-flight, tiny reminders of the home front's unseen hand guiding them. For the crews who flew the B-24s, The aircraft was both a weapon and a test of courage. Nicknamed the Flying Boxcar for its size and ungainly appearance, it was cramped inside, freezing at altitude, and vulnerable to flak. Yet pilots quickly learned to trust the rugged machine. Its long range allowed missions deep into Germany, hitting factories the Reich believed untouchable. One squadron commander later recalled his first sight of Willow Run bombers arriving en masse in England. "It was like watching an ocean move through the sky," he said. "We knew then we would never run out of planes again." Back in Berlin, the reality could no longer be ignored. At the Reich Air Ministry, Göring's aides brought him fresh reports. Cologne's industrial quarter crippled, Essen's Krupp works burning, Dortmund rail lines shredded beyond repair. And still the Americans came, day after day, their bombers flooding the skies in numbers that made German defenses look pitiful. Pilots returned from missions pale with shock. One ace slammed his goggles onto a table and spat out. "They're building them faster than we can shoot them down. Faster than we can even count them." Admiral Canaris, the quiet head of German intelligence, simply nodded. He had warned them. He had shown them photographs, reports, numbers. But the leadership, intoxicated by their own illusions of superiority, had laughed. Now the laughter was gone, replaced by an unspoken dread. The Allies had tapped into a force Germany could never match. Industry itself had become America's greatest weapon. The German high command faced an impossible truth. Even as their cities smoldered, their factories crumbled, and their young men fell on every front, America was just getting started. Willow Run was producing not dozens, but thousands of bombers. And every 63 minutes, another machine was born, another shadow destined to cross the Atlantic, another thunder to roll across the fatherland. For the German people, the psychological impact was devastating. Nights were sleepless, days filled with dread. Mothers carried their children into basements at the sound of sirens, knowing the next wave could be larger than the last. Propaganda could no longer mask the reality. The skies belonged to America's assembly lines. And still, in the heart of Michigan, the line rolled on. Every rivet was another bullet. Every fuselage was another squadron. Every hour was another death sentence for the Reich. The arsenal of democracy was no longer just a phrase. It was the truth made steel, aluminum, and fire. And for Germany, that truth was suffocating. By late 1943, Germany's heartland trembled under an enemy it could no longer reach. The Americans had turned industry itself into a weapon, and with every hour that passed in Detroit, another bomber rolled out of Willow Run. Another machine destined to cross the Atlantic, to blacken European skies, and to drop fire and steel upon the Reich. In Essen, the Krupp Steel Works, the very symbol of German industrial might, was reduced to rubble. The hammers that once rang with iron fell silent as bombs cratered assembly halls and shattered foundries. The B-24s struck with mathematical precision, targeting rail lines, power stations, bridges, cutting the arteries that kept the war machine alive. Trains laden with tanks and ammunition sat stranded on twisted rails, easy prey for the next wave. In Hamburg, the unthinkable happened. Willow Run bombers joined British Lancasters in creating a firestorm so vast, so apocalyptic, that entire neighborhoods melted into ash. Winds howled like demons, flames sucked oxygen from shelters, and thousands perished in a night that survivors called hell itself. For the first time, ordinary Germans realized the war was unwinnable, not because their soldiers lacked courage, but because their enemies possessed factories that could build destruction faster than they could bury their dead. Inside the Reich Air Ministry, the reports grew darker. Engineers begged for materials that no longer existed. Replacement aircraft dwindled. Pilots were sent into combat with only hours of training, while across the ocean, America was producing not just planes, but the crews to fly them, trained in schools that turned out graduates by the thousands. Admiral Canaris delivered the intelligence bluntly. "My Führer, Willow Run has produced more bombers this month than our entire industry combined." His words landed like bombs themselves. Göring blustered, waving his arms, shouting about German superiority, but behind his eyes was fear. He knew. The Luftwaffe was no longer the hunter. It was prey. For the men in uniform, the skies became a death sentence. German fighter squadrons scrambled daily, burning precious fuel to meet waves of liberators. But for every bomber they destroyed, 2 more appeared the next week. Pilots wrote in their diaries of despair, "We fight shadows. Kill one, and another fills its place. Endless, merciless, like the sky itself has turned against us." And for civilians, the terror was beyond imagination. Every siren wail meant more liberators overhead. Mothers clutched their children as windows rattled and roofs collapsed. Farmers watched from fields as flames consumed cities that had stood for centuries. The word Willow Run became a curse whispered in shelters, a phantom factory across the ocean that no bomb could touch, yet whose presence was felt in every German heartbeat. In Detroit, the reality was staggering. The plant consumed entire trainloads of aluminum, steel, and rubber daily. Conveyor belts stretched longer than city blocks, moving wings and fuselages past thousands of hands. The line never stopped. Night blurred into day and day into night, as welders, riveters, and machinists kept pace with a demand history had never seen. Willow Run was not simply a factory. It was a living organism, breathing out bombers with clockwork precision. And the bombers it created were not simply machines. They were symbols. To the Germans, they were proof that America had mastered the art of war without even firing a rifle. To the Allies, they were hope, proof that democracy could outbuild dictatorship, that freedom could outlast tyranny. By 1944, the effect was undeniable. The Ruhr, once the beating heart of German production, was strangled. Coal shipments halted. Factories starved of power. Locomotives rusted on abandoned tracks. Without fuel, without steel, without rails, the Wehrmacht could no longer fight at the scale Hitler demanded. In Berlin, whispers spread among officers. Could they sustain the war another year? Another month? Even the most loyal generals admitted in private, "We cannot defeat machines built every hour. Not even the bravest soldier can fight an army of factories." Yet still, the Reich's leaders clung to denial. They insisted that America's planes were inferior, that mass production meant weakness. But on the ground, in the ruins of Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin, the truth was written in ash. The B-24s, born every 63 minutes, carried not just bombs, but inevitability. For the first time since 1939, Germans began to grasp that the war they had unleashed was turning back upon them. Their enemies were no longer distant armies or isolated nations. Their enemy was a machine a mile long, built on farmland in Michigan, powered by workers who had never set foot on a battlefield, but whose hands could shape the destiny of the world. Every new bomber that rolled off Willow Run's line was a message, carried across the Atlantic, painted in contrails and written in fire. Germany could not win. And deep in their hearts, even the most faithful Nazis knew it. By 1944, the hum of Willow Run was no longer an experiment. It was a thunderous certainty. The numbers alone told the story. One B-24 bomber, every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In a single month, the plant produced more aircraft than some entire nations could muster in a year. What had once been dismissed by the Reich as impossible now filled the skies of Europe in overwhelming waves of silver. The reports that reached Berlin were no longer whispers from neutral diplomats or smuggled photographs. They came in the form of firestorms. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Kassel learned firsthand what it meant when the United States harnessed its assembly lines for war. For every bomber shot down, another seemed to appear instantly, its engines droning with relentless inevitability. Inside Willow Run, the pace never slowed. The factory floor became a small city unto itself. Cafeterias fed thousands at a time, buses carried workers in shifts around the clock, and Ford engineers devised new ways to shave seconds, then minutes, then hours off production schedules. Riveters joked that they weren't just building bombers, they were building victory itself. The irony was not lost on many. The plant had been designed by men who once built cars for middle-class families. Now those same engineers built machines that could erase entire city blocks in a single sortie. The language of consumerism, efficiency, affordability, speed, had become the language of war. To the Germans, the effect was crushing. Luftwaffe pilots, already exhausted by years of attrition, now found themselves swarmed by formations so vast that the sky seemed filled with nothing but enemy wings. For every Heinkel or Messerschmitt that rose to meet them, there were dozens of Liberators, and flying fortresses waiting, bristling with defensive guns and accompanied by the new long-range escorts, the P-51 Mustangs, that could chase German fighters back to their very airfields. By the summer of 1944, Germany's industrial heartland was being pounded day and night. Factories that had once produced synthetic fuel, tanks, and V-weapons were reduced to rubble. Railway lines splintered, bridges collapsed, and oil refineries erupted in pillars of smoke. And behind it all was the same unending source, the assembly lines of America, spitting out bombers and fighters with mechanical regularity. In the mess halls of Luftwaffe squadrons, pilots spoke in hushed tones of the endless swarm. Some compared it to a plague, an unceasing tide of machines that could not be stopped. Göring's earlier words, that quality would defeat quantity, now rang hollow. The quality of German engineering could not replace a pilot killed or a factory destroyed. The Reich could not repair faster than the Americans could build. What many German officers never knew was that Willow Run itself had been far from perfect. The plant had faced delays, labor shortages, even production failures in its early months. At one point, critics sneered that the assembly line produced more problems than planes. But by 1943, the lessons had been learned. Ford and his engineers pushed through the chaos, standardizing parts, training workers by the thousands, and turning chaos into order. The factory that had once struggled to produce even a handful of bombers now churned out hundreds without pause. And it was not just Willow Run. Across the United States, factories in California, Texas, and New York followed its model, adapting the principles of mass production to everything from tanks to warships. Entire cities became engines of war. Shipyards launched Liberty ships in mere days. Tank factories in Chicago produced Shermans as if they were farm equipment. It was a scale of production so vast that even America's allies struggled to comprehend it. For Britain, battered and weary after years of standing alone, the flood of American machines was salvation. Liberators escorted convoys across the Atlantic, hunting U-boats with ruthless efficiency. Bombers joined British Lancasters in devastating raids across the Reich. Together, the Allies began to squeeze Germany from the sky, day after day, night after night. On the ground, the German population felt the consequences. Families huddled in cellars as the distant growl of engines drew closer. Anti-aircraft batteries thundered in vain against waves of silver specks that never seemed to end. For every bomber lost, another took its place. For every factory struck, a dozen more were already being targeted. The people of Germany began to understand what their leaders had denied. This was not a war of equals. This was a war against an industrial colossus. Yet, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Willow Run was not just the machines it built, but the people who built them. Housewives who had never held a wrench became expert riveters. Farmers' sons became machinists. African-American workers, often segregated and excluded from better jobs, found opportunities in the factory halls. Immigrants fresh off ships from Europe learned English as they learned to weld. Willow Run was not only producing bombers, it was reshaping American society. Many workers felt a deep pride in their labor. They pinned photographs of sons, brothers, and husbands in uniform above their stations, reminding themselves that every rivet, every bolt, every wing fitted to a fuselage might one day protect those they loved. The war effort was personal, immediate, and urgent. Back in Berlin, reports of this workforce trickled in. Some Nazi officials scoffed at the idea that women and minorities could produce machines of war. But those illusions shattered as the skies grew darker with squadrons of American bombers. The Reich had placed its faith in ideology. America had placed its faith in industry, and industry was proving the stronger weapon. By late 1944, the effect was undeniable. Germany's war economy was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing. Oil was scarce, railways lay shattered, and the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Every Liberator that rolled off the line at Willow Run added to the pressure, each one carrying the promise of another mission, another strike, another step closer to Germany's defeat. The arsenal of democracy had reached its full roar. What had begun as whispers in smoky rooms in Berlin was now a deafening reality, shaking the Reich to its very foundations. The dream of Nazi domination was being buried beneath a tide of steel, aluminum, and fire, assembled not in secret laboratories or elite workshops, but on the factory floors of ordinary men and women. And still, the line at Willow Run kept moving, hour after hour, day after day, until the war itself began to break beneath the weight of American production. By the dawn of 1945, the truth could no longer be denied, even by those who once scoffed at the reports. The vision that German officers had dismissed in that smoke-filled chamber 2 years earlier had become the nightmare that haunted every German city and soldier. The Willow Run liberators filled the skies, not as rumors, not as propaganda, but as an unending wave of steel and fire. Berlin itself, once the proud heart of the Reich, shuddered beneath their shadows. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash and stone. Railways were splintered, fuel depots annihilated, and the once proud Luftwaffe, grounded, crippled, its pilots outnumbered and outflown, could do little more than watch the devastation from below. America's industrial miracle had moved beyond numbers on a page. It was now the sound of endless engines rumbling across the heavens. Inside Germany, despair replaced disbelief. Families whispered of der endlose Himmel, the endless sky. No matter where one turned, the drone of bombers was always near. In the factories, workers toiled only to see their creations destroyed before leaving the rail yard. On the front, soldiers watched as bridges collapsed, fuel dried up, and reinforcements never came. What began as doubt had transformed into a heavy, suffocating truth. The Reich was being drowned in machinery it could not hope to equal. For Willow Run, the year 1945 was a culmination. The assembly lines, perfected through trial and error, reached their zenith. More than 8,600 B-24 bombers had rolled from its cavernous halls, each one a testament to what industry, organization, and human determination could achieve. When combined with other plants across the United States, the output was staggering. Over 18,000 liberators in total, each one assembled not in secret workshops, but on factory floors filled with ordinary citizens. The impact on the battlefield was devastating. In the East, the Soviets advanced relentlessly, supported by Lend-Lease convoys of American trucks, tanks, and aircraft. In the West, D-Day had succeeded in part because the skies above Normandy were owned by the Allies, secured by fleets of aircraft born in Detroit, California, and Texas. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, Germany was being attacked from every direction, an encirclement powered by the arsenal of democracy. Even German soldiers understood. Captured diaries from the front are filled with bitter acknowledgments. One infantryman scrawled, "For every machine we destroy, the Americans build 10 more. We cannot fight a factory." Another Luftwaffe pilot wrote shortly before his death, "It is not the enemy in the cockpit that defeats us. It is the endless supply of cockpits." The Luftwaffe's finest aces, men like Galland and Hartmann, could not alter the math. Skill could not replace numbers. Courage could not fill fuel tanks. Germany's proud belief that engineering brilliance would outweigh American assembly lines had collapsed under the weight of reality. Willow Run was more than a factory. It was the weapon that Germany could not shoot down. But in America, the story was told differently. For the workers of Willow Run, victory was measured not in the destruction of cities, but in the lives saved. Each bomber, each mission, was a step closer to ending the war and bringing loved ones home. Women like Rosie the Riveter became cultural icons, their faces plastered on posters and newspapers. Families across the nation understood that while their sons fought overseas, they too were soldiers, in coveralls, in welding masks, in assembly lines that stretched farther than the eye could see. Henry Ford himself had not lived to see the end of the war, but his vision, and the machinery he created, had altered its course. The man who once dreamed of putting cars in every American driveway had inadvertently put bombers in every Allied sky. The contradictions were striking. A pacifist industrialist had created one of history's most fearsome engines of war. Yet his factory at Willow Run stood as proof that America's strength was not merely in its soldiers, but in its ability to turn dreams of industry into weapons of survival. By April 1945, Germany was collapsing. Hitler raged in his bunker as the city above him fell under constant bombardment. Tanks rolled in from the east, Allied divisions closed in from the west, and above them all the roar of Allied bombers echoed, a sound that had come to define defeat for the Reich. When Berlin finally fell in May, the war in Europe ended not only with the clash of armies, but with the knowledge that American factories had forged the tools of victory. For the Germans who had once dismissed the reports, the irony was bitter. The file stamped confidential. High priority had been true all along. The Americans had done what they claimed. They had built a bomber every hour, turning industry into a weapon the Reich could never match. The war had not been lost solely on the battlefield. It had been lost in the factories, in the endless hum of Willow Run, in the rivets hammered by hands the Nazis had called unworthy. And when the guns finally fell silent, the world took stock of what had been achieved. The Willow Run plant closed its bomber lines, its purpose fulfilled, but its legacy lived on. It had proven that in the modern age, wars were not only fought with courage, strategy, or weapons. They were fought with production. They were fought in the ability of a nation to transform its economy, its workforce, its very identity into an engine of survival. In the quiet after the storm, a single truth lingered. Germany had underestimated not just America's factories, but America's spirit. What the Reich believed impossible had become the very force that crushed it. And for the men who once sat in that smoke-filled chamber in Berlin, scoffing at the idea of bombers built like automobiles, the laughter had long since faded into silence. The arsenal of democracy had spoken. It roared not with speeches or ideology, but with the thunder of engines, the clatter of rivets, the endless march of machinery. And when it did, it shattered the dream of Nazi conquest forever.